Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial, and today is one of the coolest videos we've ever gotten to film because we finally have documented proof of one of those wild rumors that's out there. This is very similar to that video where Midway and us worked together to figure out which, if the Iowa class and the Midway class have the same engines. This is awesome. You guys have all heard this rumor that in the 1980s, when the Iowas are being brought back to service, the Navy goes out to museum ships and strips parts off for reactivating the Iowas. We've all heard that. I've even seen it in documentaries before, but I've never seen proof or what those parts were. One can assume that the parts that were removed were either engineering or gunnery related. Those are the oldest systems that tend to be retained by these ships. But you know, what do you know for sure? When we go and visit things like the cruiser Salem, they are missing a lot of their equipment in their plotting rooms, and they assume that it gets taken off for the Iowa-class battleships, but this was done while the ship was in mothballs. It wasn't done when it was actually a museum. The battleship Massachusetts had lost a lot of equipment, and even things like watertight doors. And again, some of it they knew went to support the construction of Kitty Hawk, which was surprising to hear. And some of it they assumed or knew via docent lore and rumor. You know, that ship's been a museum since the 1960s. They knew that the Navy had come and taken things off in the 80s, but they didn't know what or have any of the documentation. Well, we are today in the Buffalo Naval Park in Buffalo, New York, and we're on board the cruiser USS Little Rock. Little Rock was a World War II era Cleveland-class cruiser that got modernized with missiles in the 1950s. This means that she was retained a lot longer than the other Clevelands. Now, she is decommissioned in the 1970s and turned into a museum ship almost immediately. All of her sister converted ships are gone by the 1980s. So when the Iowas come along and they need parts to redo them and modernize them, there just aren't that many left. You've got some on the museum battleships, but you've only got this one modern cruiser at that time. Salem would eventually become a museum ship as well, giving us just 2 modern cruisers compared to 8 battleships and 5 aircraft carriers. Where's the justice in that? Alaska would have made a beautiful museum ship. Anyway, you come down here into the secondary plotting room of USS Little Rock, and you immediately notice that they're missing their Mark 6 stable element. This is the trigger group for the 5-inch guns. You know, their Ford Mark 1 Able is here, their Star Shell stuff is here, but if you look over my shoulder, a bunch of the switches have been cut out of the fire control board. Specific ones. Now, this is secondary plot. Let's head over to main battery plot. So even though they only have 6-inch guns compared to the 16-inch guns on an Iowa-class battleship, you notice they still have a Mark 8 rangekeeper. And they would have had a Mark 48 shore bombardment computer added in the 50s. And you can't see it because of the console in the way, but there's nothing to see. There's a hole in the deck where the stable vertical, the trigger console for the main battery guns, is missing. You can see other missing equipment around the room, including right here. So, clearly things have been stripped out, and not just like cut and demilitarized like we've seen in other places, because the Mark 48 hasn't been demilitarized at all. They put plexi over it, and besides a little bit of corrosion from age, there's nothing, like it isn't all cut inside and demilitarized. So, we have a suspicion that the Navy has come on here to strip parts for Iowa-class battleships. These are the sort of parts that you would expect to see removed. Well, Shane Stevenson, the curator here at the Buffalo Naval Park, has the receipts. He's got a letter from the Navy requesting parts. Our contracts with the Navy all say that the Navy can come back and take parts, and that they will make a good faith effort to replace working parts that they take with non-working parts to like fill in the gaps. Now clearly That is not done here. There aren't any non-working Mark 48s. There are such a small number of that they can't be replaced. And many of the parts here, he believes, were not taken to specifically put on a battleship that day. They were taken to keep as spare parts in the inventory for as the battleships are used if they suffer maintenance casualties or combat damage, then those spare parts already exist to fix them. So his letter is from mid-1988. They are contacted by the Naval Ordnance Station in Louisville, and it is part of the Battleship Supply Support Improvement Program, or SSIP. They were specifically requesting the Mark 48 computer, the Mark 41 stable vertical, Mark 1 selector drive, Mark 10 control panel, which is probably here. The selector drive might be one of the missing switches there. And the Mark 13 radar console, rectifier cabinet, and amplifier cabinet. Actually, one of those cabinets is probably this. And that would have been part of it, and this would have been part of it, I'm betting. And from secondary battery, the Mark 6 stable element, the trigger console, and the Mark 7 control panel. So we saw a bunch of gaps in their control panel there. And then in November of 1988, contractors come on board and remove the equipment. In mid-1988, Wisconsin is still being reactivated. So this is interesting. Missouri, Iowa, and New Jersey have already been reactivated at this point and, in theory, already have all their equipment. By November of 1988, Wisconsin is more or less done. Now, they may have installed some new equipment at that point, reactivated the ship, and then tried to get this equipment and put it in later. But that supports the idea that a lot of this was just going into storage and spare parts. If at this point all 4 Iowas have been reactivated, have joined the fleet, and are in active service. And in fact, Iowa's very close to being taken out of service. And so, in theory, that ship can be stripped for spare parts. That said, I have a strong suspicion that the Mark 48 shore bombardment computer may be one of the ones installed on Wisconsin. So, the U.S. Navy makes a very small number of these computers. They are an add-on to the Mark 8 Rangekeeper, essentially, in the 1950s. So many of our gunships do not exist anymore by the 1950s, or they're in mothballs, they're not reactivated, etc. Each of the 4 Iowa-class battleships is brought back to serve in Korea, and each one gets a single Mark 48 in forward plot. So at this point, all the Iowas have one. By the time they're decommissioned, each of them had a second one installed in aft plot. New Jersey gets one installed in 1968 when she's being reactivated for Vietnam. None of the other battleships are reactivated at that point, so they don't get any. Where does New Jersey's come from? They don't make it new. They must be taking it off of one of the existing gun cruisers. Many of the gun cruisers, even the ones that survived to the Korean War, have been scrapped at this point. The missile cruisers are still left, and a handful of pure gun cruisers such as Newport News and St. Paul are still in service at this point. So obviously they aren't losing their computers. My suspicion is our computer would have been taken off of a ship like Salem or Des Moines, which were held in mothballs at that time. So Iowa gets brought back, Missouri gets brought back in 84 and 86 respectively. They each likely got a Mark 48 from Des Moines and Newport News, assuming we got ours from Salem. Those 3 ships were still held in mothballs, and they were even looked at for reactivation armed with Tomahawks in the 80s alongside the Iowas, or as a cheaper alternative to the Iowas. They were chosen not to be used, and so we were pretty sure they were stripped for parts. Now, so the 3 Des Moines, 3 Mark 48 computers, the first 3 Iowas likely get them. Wisconsin comes back. Where do you get one of those computers? By this point, your older missile-armed World War II era cruisers are being taken out of service and are largely scrapped. They're gone. But which one is left? Little Rock was a museum ship. She was the only one preserved as a museum ship. So that's why the Navy knew that some of this rare World War II era equipment was still on this ship and not anywhere else, including that hunk of gold right there, the Mark 48. So there's a strong chance that this Mark 48 becomes the one in Wisconsin's after plot. There's also a possibility that they found one for Wisconsin from elsewhere and that this one ends up going into reserve and was around for spare parts. Unfortunately, when the Iowa-class program is decommissioned, they hold spare parts into the 20-teens for possible reactivation of Iowa and Wisconsin. But by now, those parts are probably all gone. We know they were getting rid of ammunition and other things like that. We're not entirely sure about the spare parts that were still in storage. Regardless, they have not been given back to the ships that they were originally taken from. So, this is so freaking cool. It's another myth that we've been able to prove and figure out where it came from. We have actual documentation. I should say that Shane in Buffalo has actual documentation that these parts were taken off of the older World War II era museum ships to be used during the Iowa-class program. And that is, it's so cool for me to prove these rumors that, you know, people talk about it, and old-timers have even said, oh, I was here when that happened or whatnot. But there's no documentation to say who did it or when or why. And now we have seen that. What is another rumor, preferably about Iowa-class battleships, but not necessarily, that you've heard about but you've never gotten proof for? Let us know in the comment section down below. In our travels, maybe we'll run into someone who can help us answer that rumor. Battleship New Jersey partners with other museum ships in the fleet to film these videos and to do historical research like this. So we really appreciate Midway's help the other month with that video, and now Shane here in Buffalo has really helped us out, and we appreciate that. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. Really appreciate your support. Consider donating to the ongoing restoration at the Buffalo Naval Park. In addition to Little Rock, they have the Sullivans and Croker. So they've got a 3-ship park here. And of course, the spaces we've been filming in today are not restored. They're not on the tour route. So your donations could help open up more spaces on this ship. Really cool spaces that not only help tell Little Rock's story, they help tell the story of all of our museum ships. So there's a link in the description below to donate. There's a link in the description below to their social media. You can see more of the content that Shane's been putting out on his research. You can support Battleship New Jersey by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find about us and our museum. Thanks for watching.